Today is July 21st, 2025, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you're interested in learning what we're doing to not only restore classical Catholic education, but do so in a responsible way with accreditation, check out our work online at classicalliberalarts.com. In this talk today, I'd like to address a topic that I've run into a number of times over the years, and it's the topic of unschooling. Unschooling. It's, I wouldn't say popular because nothing about homeschooling is popular, but it's a common idea about education that we run into when talking to parents, and for some reasons it has an attraction to homeschooling parents. And I'd like to take some time today to talk about unschooling, to get down to the philosophical, maybe even theological roots of this idea of unschooling, and provide a pretty strong criticism and warning against not only the idea but the practice. And I'd like to invite homeschooling families to listen to what I have to say, because I think this is a great mistake among Christian families, one that we've got to be careful to examine our thoughts and our actions and ask what the origin of them might be and why many are attracted to this idea of unschooling. Unschooling is, again, an educational method, an idea. It's sort of ironic to call it an educational method because it's really not a method. It's more of a philosophy of education or raising children. Common, not popular again, but common among Christian families. And it leads to a lot of confusion about the true nature and purpose of education. It's promoted as a sort of natural, child-centered alternative to institutional schooling. And it claims to free children from the constraints of curriculum, authority, external evaluation, and so on. It advocates instead for a self-directed approach. And when we say self-directed, we mean directed by the child. A self-directed approach in which the child's interests, the child's curiosities, and the child's motivations determine both the substance and the timing of their learning. This is the idea of unschooling. Now, while this rhetoric, especially when we use phrases like natural and child-centered, the rhetoric may appear appealing, especially when we consider the failures of modern state education systems. But unschooling is not a neutral, pedagogical alternative to modern schooling. It's actually a false dilemma we have here, as if the two options are hand your child over to the state-run public school or unschool. And it's often presented as this false dilemma. Unschooling is a philosophical system. It's a worldview. It's a philosophy of the nature of children. It's a philosophy of education, a philosophy of family life that's built upon anthropological, moral, and theological assumptions that directly contradict Catholic teaching. Let me say that again. Unschooling is a philosophical system built upon assumptions, anthropological assumptions, moral assumptions, theological assumptions that directly contradict Catholic teaching. It rests upon a false view of human nature, very common today, but false. It denies the necessity of discipline and formation and undermines the transmission of Christian culture within families and society. And what I'd like to do is demonstrate this. I'd like to demonstrate that unschooling is incompatible with the Catholic faith and that it weakens the foundations of Christian life by removing children from an ordered and disciplined path to wisdom. So first, to go a little bit deeper, what is unschooling? Where does this idea come from? What is unschooling? Unschooling is a form of homeschooling. It's not something that can be practiced by a school, obviously. It's a form of homeschooling in which traditional structures of education, like curricula, assigned lessons, teacher-led instruction, testing, and so on, are all rejected. They're rejected as unnatural, contrary to the good of children, and so on. Unschooling holds that education should arise in a sort of organic way from the child's interests and experiences. One of the founders of this unschooling movement was a man named John Holt, Holt, and he said this in a book published back in 1981 titled Teach Your Own. He said, "Learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of the learners." Learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of the learners. And so we see that there's this rejection of a sense of need for any kind of formal direction or instruction. But it's really the work of individuals, and in this case, children themselves. This philosophy shifts the responsibility for directing education from the parent or teacher to the child. The parent becomes a facilitator rather than an instructor. The child becomes the agent of their own intellectual development. And again, this is all theoretical. The educational content is not delivered to the child or imposed on the child. It's discovered by the child when and if the child seeks it. The model of unschooling is a reactive model on behalf of the parents, not a proactive model. So we are basically leaving the child as this sort of natural learner to seek out whatever he or she wants. And both, as I said, the substance and the timing of that learning is really directed by the interests of the child. This is the idea of unschooling. Now, we have to ask the question, where are these ideas coming from? Or where have these ideas been taught before in history? And when we think about the history of philosophical or educational philosophy, it's very easy to see where these ideas are coming from. They're coming from the Romantic period, and that's not a good thing. Don't think romantic in a good sense. Many of those who are advocating for unschooling today are Christians, usually parents. But the intellectual origin of this idea of unschooling is not a Christian idea. It's a modern secular philosophy. And if we were to ask, who is the representative, who is the source or the real master of this philosophical idea, it's a writer named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived and worked back in the 18th century. Just remember the last name, Rousseau. Roussseau, Rousseau. He wrote a book titled Emile, E-M-I-L-E. It was published in 1762. Emile. It's a book on education. Rousseau argued in that book, and in his philosophy in general, he argued that children are born good, and that society corrupts these good children. Children are born good, and society corrupts the children. Obviously, if you've studied any psychology, you'll see very clearly that Rousseau taught that nurture was responsible for the ruin of children, and that the nature of children was good. He taught that education, this is going back to Rousseau, he taught that education should consist primarily in allowing the natural development of the child to proceed without interference, because the child is good and society is the source of the evil. If the child was just allowed to develop, his development would all be good. That sort of natural goodness would just come to perfection. And consequently, any imposed curriculum or direction or shaping and molding from adults would distort the child's innate purity. Rousseau's view of man as naturally good, I mean, if man isn't viewed as good, then why would we possibly suggest that leaving him to his own devices would lead to good results? There must be an assumption that these interests in the child, or these natural interests in men, are good. This view that man is naturally good and corrupted by external structures directly contradicts the Christian doctrine of original sin, which is fundamental to the Christian faith. Now, we're not denying that there can be societal influences that corrupt and destroy an individual. Proverbs teaches that bad company corrupts good morals. Obviously, false teaching and unjust political structures or unjust social structures, obviously they're destructive. We're not denying that. What we're denying is this opposite extreme, that nature is good. The nature of man in a child is good. That is the opposite extreme, and it goes too far. It contradicts the Christian doctrine of original sin. The Catholic Church teaches that a man inherits a fallen nature from Adam, the first man, and that his intellect and his will are disordered by nature. Man is disordered by nature, not in his creation, not by design, but as a consequence of human history, as a consequence of the sin of our first parent, which corrupted our race, as it were, and we inherit that corruption. We are not naturally good. We are originally good. At creation, we were good. God called all things good. In fact, after he made man, he said it was very good. But we're talking about human beings after the fall. Human beings after the fall are not innocent. They are not good. They're corrupt and they're inclined to evil. Consequently, the human soul must be formed, corrected, and guided towards truth and virtue. If left to itself, it does not naturally move towards wisdom or goodness. Unschooling, therefore, shares with Rousseau this assumption that the child's interior disposition is trustworthy and inclined to do good, and that external impositions, things imposed upon it from the outside, should be suspected of evil. It implicitly denies or ignores the reality of sin. It ignores the need for correction and the value of intellectual authority, that there is order in society. And this places this view of unschooling in fundamental conflict with Catholic tradition, with just timeless Christian doctrine, the articles of faith themselves. The Catholic Church has always taught that education is an act of formation. And formation, when we use this term formation, we mean the deliberate shaping of the soul according to divine truth. And just to give a quick illustration, when we grow trees in an orchard, we don't just allow the trees to grow naturally. If we do, the result is not good. The result is bad and harmful for the tree. It doesn't lead the tree to perfection, because the tree was created by God to be cared for by a rational creature, namely man. And so it's nature, under the influence of reason, that produces the good fruits of nature, that allows natural things to come to perfection. And so we form a tree, we shape a tree, we prune the tree. We don't allow it to just grow however it wants to, but we manage it and cultivate and care for it and lead it to perfection. Pope Pius XI, in an encyclical titled Divini Ilius Magistri, said the following about education, and this was in 1929. He said, "Education consists essentially in preparing man for what he must be and for what he must do here below, in order to attain the sublime end for which he was created. Education is a work of preparation. This preparation requires that children be taught what is true, not merely what they desire to know. It requires that children be trained in what is right, in good habits, and not merely allowed to act as they please. The end of education is not personal satisfaction, not individual satisfaction, but moral and intellectual perfection that allows the individual to become a member of human society and share in the common good, and ultimately serve God as the end of human of human life and purpose. Unschooling, on the other hand, removes the teacher from the role of active formation, like removing the gardener from the garden and just letting everything grow naturally. It suspends judgment about what is worth knowing and defers all of the parents' or teachers' study and experience is simply cast aside, and the adult community defers to the child's preferences. It doesn't aim at the perfection of the soul, according to divine wisdom, but to this romantic unfolding of personality, whatever that means, according to the will of the individual child. And in doing so, it replaces the authority of truth, the objectivity of truth, with this autonomy of the individual child. It really flips everything upside down, and again is a contradiction of the Christian doctrine of the nature and condition of man. Catholic parents aren't free to just give up their role as educators. This isn't an option for Catholic parents. We're taught in the scriptures to train up a child in the way he should go. Catholic parents don't have the option of saying, I'm not going to train my child. Parents are entrusted with a grave responsibility, and this isn't just an individual spiritual responsibility. This is a social responsibility. Parents are entrusted with a very grave responsibility to guide their children in the truth of the Christian faith and in all matters necessary for a life ordered by reason. The parents are, as it were, the first line of law enforcement. They teach their children how to live positively, and they're the first law enforcers. And if we ask, what role do police play? Well, when children refuse to submit to the authority of their parents, and their parents are not able to enforce the law, as it were, the moral law or even the civil law, police officers step up and take over from there. So parents have a role in society as being the first teachers and trainers of their children and the enforcers of the natural law, the scriptural law, the Christian law, church law, social law, and so on. The Catechism says that parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. They bear witness to this responsibility by creating a home where tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service are the rule. This environment that's described in the Catechism is not some kind of passive laboratory where the children do whatever they want and all the adults stand around and just observe what the children do. Parents are expected to provide instruction, teaching children what to do, providing them with knowledge, positive knowledge of what to do. Parents must provide correction. When children do bad things, parents must correct them, lest bad habits develop, which can be life-threatening and destructive. And parents must also provide example, which is part of instruction, showing the children what a mature life, a reasonable, prudent, virtuous life looks like down the road. Instruction, correction, and example are the three principal duties of parents with respect to the education of their children. Parents must direct the intellect and will of a child toward virtue. That's their role. They must lead the child, at least by means of initiation, into the tradition of the church and into the intellectual heritage of Christian civilization as people who live 2,000 years into Christian history, 6,000 years into human history. We don't live as if we're the first humans to ever be born. We realize that wise and holy men have lived for thousands of years in the world, and great knowledge and great systems of law and order have developed over time. And we don't start from scratch with every new birth. Unschooling undermines the duty of parents by encouraging this reckless belief that the child should direct his own intellectual formation. The child's ignorant and evil, because of concupiscence, choices become the rule. The parent's role is diminished from that of authority to that of a mere supporter. The result is not more authentic expression of a child's identity. It's not something better, but a failure to introduce the child to the riches of an intellectual and spiritual tradition into which he has been born late in human history. Catholic education has always recognized the essential role of discipline in forming young people. Children are not born with habits of rational thinking. They're not born with some sort of natural love of virtue. These things must be instilled in the children through constant effort by the parents, through structure, and by means of correction. Scripture says these things constantly. For example, in Proverbs chapter 22, we read about the nature of a child, and we're taught that folly or foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and it goes on to say, the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. In other words, children are not wise. They're not good if left to themselves. Their hearts are filled with foolishness. And they are set by God's own wisdom. They're set under the direction of parents who are responsible to train that foolishness out of them. And this is what's referred to as the rod of discipline. Now, in some traditions, this rod of discipline is taken literally to mean a physical rod for spanking, things like that. We can think back to, old stories of schoolmasters cracking kids' knuckles with a ruler. That's certainly an example of the rod of discipline, but it refers to any kind of corrective treatment, any kind of punishment, any kind of reward system, any kind of warning, any kind of negative consequence to bad behavior. The rod of discipline drives that foolishness out of a child. And it can come in a million different forms in God's providence. For example, there can be a kid who's got a big mouth, who likes to annoy people, who likes to say all kinds of nasty things to people, and it can take one day out in the schoolyard for that kid to get his butt whooped by another kid, and that school fight becomes the rod of discipline, which drives that foolishness out of that kid's heart. It could be acting recklessly, like I had a friend growing up who was chasing another kid, jumped on his bike, raced out into the road right in front of a car and got run over by a car. The rod of discipline can chase that foolishness out of the heart of a child. And of course, that that discipline is not only the active discipline exercised or carried out by parents, but it's also the discipline of providence that God himself works out in a person's life. Proverbs chapter 13 says, he who spares the rod, he who does not correct his children, hates his son. But he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. And we see the real nature of true discipline. And we're not talking about some kind of imbalanced, irrational, destructive punishment. We're talking about discipline and correction. The father who loves his son is diligent to discipline him. Why? Because he doesn't want him to develop bad habits and suffer the consequences of such. He wants to keep them far away from his son and allow his son to grow. Even if his son kicks and fights against it when he's young because he's foolish, he wants to protect his child from destructive behaviors until his son comes to an age where experience begins to help him understand what his father's telling him, and he can turn around and appreciate the help his father gave him by not allowing him to do his own will when he was foolish and young. St. Thomas Aquinas explains that the will must be trained to choose what is good. It's not natural. That the intellect must be habituated or prepared or disposed to grasp what is true. There's work to be done to help children come to perfection. This doesn't occur naturally. It requires the guidance of one who is wiser, and God has designed society so that children are always under the direction of experienced adults. Unschooling rejects the necessity of this imposed discipline, just flies in the face of the teaching of sacred scripture. It assumes that a child will come to wisdom if he's just left alone. But this is contrary both to reason and experience. Without discipline, children do not become wise. They remain ignorant, and they develop all kinds of destructive, bad habits that make the children loathsome to others. It carries a double punishment. Without correction, children do not become virtuous. They follow their passions. And human beings are not designed to follow their passions. The passions by themselves, if not governed by reason, lead to all kinds of evil. The passions exist naturally in subjection to human reason. The Catholic tradition, Catholic doctrine, cannot support a system that denies the basic facts of human nature. When we talk about Christian culture is not a spontaneous product of individual choices. Christian culture doesn't just happen. It's not natural. It's a cultivated inheritance. Christian culture is artificial in the sense that men have to work to actually produce it. And Christian culture is inherited. It's passed down from one generation to another through discipline, liturgy, education, and so on. It's not transmitted by mere suggestions, but by formation. Fathers and mothers must train their children in Christian thought, Christian habits, Christian language, and so on. Not merely expose them to such things if and when a child shows interest. The child is not the boss. The Christian family must imitate the church. The church is structured. The church is hierarchical. The church is authoritative. The church is committed to an objective truth that's outside of the judgment of any individual Christians. It can't resemble a workshop filled with individuals doing their own personal projects. That's not how the church works. When unschooling enters Christian families, it introduces disorder, just total chaos. It separates the child from this inheritance of Christian civilization. It delays or even avoids any rigorous study of theology, philosophy, scripture, sacred tradition, and so on. What are catechisms even for, if not for disciplined and orderly instruction of children? It trains children to expect learning to conform to their interests, that is, unschooling. It teaches them to expect learning to be, pleasant or just always a result of what they desire, what their impulses lead them to do, and doesn't teach them to subject themselves to the authority of the church or to the authority of the great philosophers and wise men of history who've established arts and sciences to direct human society. Over time, this unschooling erodes the internal culture of the family. It turns the family into a ghetto. Intellectual unity dissolves. There's no more like-mindedness. There's no more objective truth or order intellectually. Liturgical life weakens. There's no more structure in religion. Any kind of shared pursuit of truth gives way to just this individual self-expression, this individual curiosity. The family ceases to function as a cell or source of Christian culture and becomes just a collection of, again, personal projects, individuals doing whatever they want. And so the result is a loss of continuity with the church's educational and civilizational mission. Just a real breakdown of the purpose of the family. Unschooling often emphasizes experience over instruction, but notice it's only the experience of the children. The experience of the adults is banished from the school. It's banished from the life of a child. So for some reason, the experience of the child is considered good and important, but the experience of the adults is considered detrimental to the children. Just really doesn't make any sense. Children are expected to learn things by doing them, rather than being taught by parents who have already done them. Catholic education, on the other hand, is oriented towards wisdom. That is, the habit of judging rightly according to the highest causes, things that children don't even understand. Wisdom is not acquired passively. It's not acquired by chance, by just bouncing around like a pinball. Wisdom is the fruit of disciplined study, of prayer. Wisdom is the fruit of obedience, where a child who doesn't know follows the instructions and counsel of one who does know, or at least one who knows better. Aristotle taught this idea that experience, while it's useful, obviously it's useful, we know how we gain knowledge through experience, but it's not enough. A person who lives by experience can know that something works, for example, but he doesn't understand why it works. And that's really the difference with being an educated person or an ignorant person. I've watched men in construction, electricians, plumbers, installing all kinds of devices and products that they couldn't explain the origin of. They couldn't explain how they work. They just install them. They know that they work. They don't know how they work. And it's that knowledge of how, it's the understanding of causes that is wisdom. Christian education is not just some sort of encyclopedia study. It doesn't seek to just be familiar with the world. But Christian education, all through history, was an orderly, systematic understanding of the world in light of divine revelation. Or we could even say just in light of human reason. To gain this knowledge by oneself without any instruction would be almost impossible, and very, very few would ever attain to it. But within the context in which human beings actually live by God's will, an ordered understanding can be obtained with the help of experienced teachers, timeless, proven texts, and plenty of time, which children have. This true wisdom can't be reduced to child-led exploration, just this wandering around following curiosity. Makes no sense. Children don't become mature by acting independently. When children act independently, they act childishly. Children mature by learning to imitate adults. Children become mature by learning to follow the counsel of authoritative persons, experienced persons. They learn to benefit by listening to the positive counsel of others who know from experience or from theory, and by avoiding the mistakes that others have made and which others can warn us about. Just as a child can't nourish his own body without help from others, he also can't form his own mind. He can't nourish his own soul without the guidance of a more experienced person. Unschooling promotes this illusion of autonomy when what is actually needed is participation in a religious and philosophical or moral tradition. The mind must be led by the hand of one who is more experienced or one who knows. Unschooling undermines all of this, really just completely irrational and crazy. Unschooling, it's not simply an educated choice, or an educational choice. Unschooling is a rejection of the principles upon which Catholic education and culture have been built. It assumes an explicitly false view of man, denies the need for formation, undermines parental authority, and separates the child, most tragically, separates the child from the intellectual and spiritual tradition of the church, which is the child's inheritance. It's not unschooling, that is. It's not some sort of benign or well-intentioned method for education. It's actually a false philosophy rooted in modern individualism, which began in the Renaissance, And this romanticism of philosophers like Rousseau from the 18th century, which are incompatible with the Catholic vision of man and human education. These ideas, as I said before, they have an origin, and the origin is a false philosophy. Catholic families need to reject this idea of unschooling and run away from it. They need to reject unschooling with certainty that education is a solemn duty imposed upon parents by God, which needs to be ordered toward the salvation and perfection of the soul. It must be guided by wisdom. It must be governed by authority. It must be executed with discipline. Only when these principles of parenting, principles rooted in true Christian teaching about the nature of man, the needs of children, education, and so on, only then can a family fulfill its vocation to know, love, and serve God, to seek to imitate the saints and wise men of history, and to live to become citizens of the kingdom of heaven. A rejection of unschooling, as I said before, because it's a false dilemma that's presented to many parents, to reject unschooling doesn't mean that you then just go enroll your kids in the public school. The truth and the solution is found in a golden mean between these two opposite extremes. We have to return to real classical Catholic education, not set up this false dilemma between modern school education and unschooling. The truth is in the middle between those two false extremes. It's a return to classical Catholic education. We have to research, restore, publish, and teach the classical Catholic curriculum that was known throughout history. That's not taught in these modern state schools, which are terrible, but which is also not the way of unschooling. Both of them are wrong. We need to be faithful in light of church history and Christian philosophy, and we need to respect the wisdom of the aged. We need to respect the value of experience and study, great learning, and place our children and ourselves under the direction of that authority, of that experience, of that instruction, and so on. So please, if you're a homeschooling family, if you're a Christian family considering homeschooling, stay as far away as possible from this culture of unschooling. It's a terribly short-sighted view of education. It's built upon false philosophical assumptions, and it contradicts the church's teaching on the nature of man. Stay away from unschooling.